Imagine sitting across a desk from a mild-mannered, middle-aged supply clerk.
He looks completely ordinary. He's wearing a slightly outdated suit, thick glasses, and he has this battered leather briefcase resting right on his lap.
Right, he's a grandfather, he is a former teacher. By all accounts, he is entirely unremarkable.
But what you do not know, and what the people sitting next to him on the commuter train do not know, is what he's carrying. Inside that leather briefcase is a freshly sharpened 20-centimeter hunting knife, lengths of nylon rope, a towel, and a jar of Vaseline.
You also do not know that his government is perfectly fine ignoring him, because acknowledging what he actually is would threaten to destroy their entire political ideology.
It's a terrifying reality.
It really is. Today, we are taking you, the listener, into the room with us as a third investigator. We are opening one of the darkest forensic case studies in modern history.
For this deep dive, we are synthesizing a very specific clinical stack of sources. We're examining comprehensive psychiatric profiles, comparative criminological studies, historical analyses of the Soviet justice system, and original trial records.
And our objective here is to meticulously deconstruct the timeline, the shifting modus operandi, and the psychological architecture of Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo, the predator known as the Rostov Ripper.
We will map how he operated in the Lesa Polosa, which are the forest strips of the Soviet Union, for 12 long years.
But equally important, we are going to examine the systemic ideological blindness of a state apparatus that allowed him to murder at least 52 women and children.
So we have a man with a lifetime of festering psychological anomalies carrying a literal murder kit onto public transportation, completely shielded by a society that refuses to look at him.
Psychologically speaking, that kind of pathology does not just materialize out of thin air. It has an incubation period.
Right. To understand the anatomy of this predator, we need to strip away the timeline and look at the foundation. We have to look at the environment that built his internal circuitry.
Starting in 1936 in the village of Yabloknoye in Ukraine.
The environmental baseline for Chikatilo's early life is absolute, unrelenting deprivation. He was born during the period of Joseph Stalin's forced agricultural collectivization.
Which triggered the Holodomor.
Yes, a catastrophic man-made famine across Ukraine. It is crucial to understand the mechanics of this environment on a developing human brain. You have a child born to collective farm laborers who receive no wages, living in a one-room dirt floor hut.
The chronic caloric deficit alone alters cognitive development.
Exactly. But the physical starvation was secondary to the psychological narrative he was fed by his mother. And this brings us to a concept heavily cited in the psychiatric literature regarding his case: the Stepan myth.
I want to break this down because it sounds almost like dark folklore. His mother, Anna, repeatedly told young Andrei that before he was born, he had an older brother named Stepan.
And according to the story she hammered into him, Stepan was kidnapped and cannibalized by starving neighbors.
Whether Stepan actually existed or whether this was just a cautionary tale invented by a traumatized mother remains historically unproven, right?
Right, but from a psychiatric standpoint, the objective truth of Stepan's existence is completely irrelevant. What matters is the mechanism of trauma transfer. Imagine the psychological impact of that narrative on a malnourished, highly impressionable child.
His mother was essentially telling him that the outside world views him as prey, as literal food.
Yes, this specific narrative introduced the concept of the human body as an object of consumption. It planted the seeds of a condition we refer to clinically as oral sadism.
Let's clarify that term for our listener, because when we say oral sadism, we aren't just talking about the physical act of biting. We are talking about a developmental fixation, a framework where consuming another entity is subconsciously equated with gaining ultimate control over them.
That is the precise mechanism. In classical psychoanalytic theory, oral sadism involves a desire to dominate, destroy, and possess an object by consuming it.
Which makes sense. For a child internalizing the idea of a cannibalized sibling, the human form is stripped of its humanity and reduced to a source of predatory utility.
If you are terrified of being consumed, the most extreme psychological defense mechanism is to become the consumer. This narrative provided a subconscious blueprint for power that would violently manifest decades later.
And this primary trauma was quickly compounded by further environmental horrors. He grows up amidst the brutality of World War II, he witnesses aerial bombings, he sees executions in his village.
He also develops chronic enuresis bedwetting, which is a classic physiological marker of severe childhood trauma and anxiety.
And his mother's response to this anxiety is to publicly and physically beat him. So the foundational years are defined by helplessness, public humiliation, and extreme violence.
As he transitions into adulthood, we see an intense, almost desperate attempt to construct a facade of normality.
He was building camouflage.
Precisely. I mean, he served a mandatory stint in the Army, he earned a university degree in literature, and he became a teacher. In 1963, his sister arranged a marriage for him with a woman named Fiona.
They eventually had 2 children.
Yeah. On paper, if you looked at his file, he was the model Soviet citizen. But beneath this highly curated exterior, there was a profound, festering inadequacy. And the catalyst that weaponized his childhood trauma was his chronic sexual impotence.
This feels like the critical inflection point. He is completely unable to achieve or maintain an erection under normative circumstances. His marital relations are virtually non-existent.
And we have to place this within the context of the culture. He is living in a rigidly structured, hyper-masculine Soviet society that places immense value on traditional gender roles. The internal pressure must have been staggering.
The impotence bred a venomous reservoir of rage. He felt entirely emasculated. He was humiliated in his own home, and he felt deeply inferior in society.
Because his physiology denied him normative sexual release, his pathology began seeking an alternative pathway to alleviate that immense internal tension. The sadism planted in his childhood merged with the sexual frustration of his adulthood.
He required an overwhelming stimulus, a scenario of absolute dominance to override his physiological dysfunction.
Which brings us to the snapping point, the moment the facade cracks. It is December 22nd, 1978, the first documented murder.
The victim is a 9-year-old girl named Elena Zakotnova in the city of Shakhty.
Chikatilo had recently and secretly purchased a dilapidated little hut in a low-income neighborhood. He spots Elena walking home from an ice skating rink in the late afternoon. He approaches her, leverages his authority as an adult, and lures her into this hut.
Once inside, the clinical reality of his pathology takes over. He attempts to assault her, and predictably his physiological impotence manifests. He fails.
But this time the dynamic is different. As the young girl struggles, cries, and resists, the accumulated rage of his entire life boils over. He begins to choke her.
He draws a knife and stabs her 3 times in the abdomen.
And it is in that exact horrific moment, the moment of inflicting lethal, penetrating violence, of witnessing her absolute terror and his absolute control, that he experiences sexual climax for the first time.
The neurological loop is closed. Violence and sexual gratification become inextricably, permanently linked in his brain.
He achieves through murder what he could not achieve through intimacy. He throws her body into the nearby Grushevka River, leaving behind a chaotic crime scene.
There is blood in the snow near his hut. There are witnesses who saw a man matching his description talking to the girl at a bus stop. In any functional investigative system, he would have been identified and apprehended that week.
But the system wasn't functional. The immediate aftermath of the Zakotnova murder is a catastrophic study in systemic failure. The investigative machine of the Soviet Ministry of Internal Affairs, the MVD, completely ignored the evidence pointing to the quiet family man in the hut.
Instead, they targeted a 25-year-old laborer named Alexander Kravchenko. Let's examine the mechanics of this injustice, because it is crucial to understanding how Chikatilo survived for another 12 years.
The police target Kravchenko because he has a prior criminal record for a violent offense. He is a known quantity.
But Kravchenko has an ironclad, verified alibi for the afternoon of December 22. Neighbors confirmed he was at home with his wife.
Right.
So how does an investigative body bypass a verified alibi? Do they just ignore it, or do they actively dismantle it to serve their narrative?
They actively, brutally dismantled it. The MVD operated on what was known as the Polaknaya Sistema, which is a strict quota and clearance rate system. A high-profile murder of a child was a massive political liability for the local authorities.
They needed rapid closure.
Yes, and Kravchenko was a socially convenient scapegoat. To break his alibi, investigators isolated Kravchenko's wife. They threatened to charge her as an accomplice to murder, which would mean losing her own children.
That is horrific. They threatened her friends with perjury charges, too.
Under immense psychological pressure, the witnesses altered their statements, effectively stripping Kravchenko of his alibi. They manufactured a murderer to protect their clearance rates.
They subjected Kravchenko to intense, brutal interrogation tactics until he provided a coerced confession. And even though he retracted that confession in open court, explaining exactly how it was extracted, the judicial machine ground forward.
He was convicted, and in 1983, Alexander Kravchenko was executed by a firing squad for a crime Andrei Chikatilo committed.
The tragic consequence of this bureaucratic expediency was twofold. First, an innocent man was murdered by the state. Second, it provided Chikatilo with an impenetrable psychological and legal shield.
The state had officially permanently declared that the killer of Elena Zakotnova was dead. In the mind of a budding psychopath, this is ultimate validation.
It gave him a moral alibi.
Exactly. It proved to him that he was invisible and that he was vastly superior to the system meant to catch him.
He realizes he is a ghost. But interestingly, he does show some restraint initially. The neurological loop has been established, but he doesn't immediately become a spree killer.
He waits almost 3 years. During this period, his carefully constructed life begins to fray. In early 1981, he is fired from his teaching position following multiple complaints that he was sexually assaulting his students.
But this dismissal, which should have been a massive red flag for the authorities, accidentally provides him with the perfect operational cover. He transitions into a new career. He becomes a snabzenyets, a supply clerk for a raw materials factory in Rostov.
To understand the sheer scale of the terror he is about to unleash, we must explain the exact function of a snabzenyets within the Soviet command economy.
Right. The Soviet system was notoriously inefficient and suffered from constant crippling shortages of raw materials.
Factories could not meet their production quotas because they lacked basic supplies. The role of the supply clerk was to act as a state-sanctioned fixer. His entire job was to travel extensively across the vast expanse of the USSR, visiting different factories, agricultural centers, and bureaucratic offices to secure materials.
He is a professional wanderer. His job requires him to secure these materials using charm, persuasion, barter, and often outright bribery.
Precisely. The state is literally paying him to traverse multiple Republican borders: Russia, Ukraine, Uzbekistan. This role provided him with legitimate, unquestionable freedom of movement.
If he was found hundreds of miles from home in the middle of the week, he had state-stamped papers justifying his presence.
It was the absolute perfect cover for a highly mobile predator.
It's the ultimate urban ghillie suit. You just do not look twice at the boring middle-aged supply clerk with the briefcase waiting for a train.
And starting in 1981, his hunting grounds become the transit hubs. He maps out the railway platforms, the bus stations, the tram stops, and he narrows his victimology.
He isn't hunting powerful people. He is targeting the margins of society. He goes after runaways, homeless women, sex workers, truant children, and young vagrants.
His selection process was highly calculated. Transit hubs are natural gathering points for transient populations. If a runaway or a vagrant disappears from a train station, they are not immediately reported missing. There is no immediate search party.
Furthermore, he leveraged the inherent social dynamics of the era. He used his unremarkable grandfatherly appearance to disarm them.
Right. In a society that ingrained a deep respect for elders and authority figures, a man in a suit offering a hungry child a piece of bread or a swig of vodka did not immediately trigger alarm bells.
He builds that initial bridge of trust. He might promise to show a runaway a shortcut or offer to buy them a meal. And then he leads them away from the concrete visibility of the station and into the Lesopolosa.
These are the long, dense strips of woodland planted alongside railways and agricultural fields throughout the Soviet Union to prevent soil erosion and act as windbreaks.
They are geographically brilliant hunting grounds because they are instantly accessible from the transit hubs, yet visually impenetrable from the tracks.
Once he crosses that tree line with a victim, the forensic ritual begins. And the escalation of violence here is incredibly difficult to process.
The ritual inside the Lesopolosa was remarkably, terrifyingly consistent. He would isolate the victim and initiate a sexual encounter. With adult women, he would attempt normative intercourse.
But the psychological baseline had not changed. His physiological impotence would inevitably manifest. He would fail. The victim, who was often a hardened vagrant or sex worker, might express annoyance or actively mock his failure.
That mockery acted as an explosive psychological trigger. It instantly transitioned his profound lifelong shame into a homicidal frenzy.
And we need to analyze the anatomy of that frenzy. We are not talking about a single efficient fatal wound. We are talking about 30 to 50 deep stab wounds per victim. This isn't just murder. This is an absolute obliteration of the human form.
The extreme overkill is a hallmark of his specific pathology. The knife became a substitute for his physiological failure.
The frantic, disorganized, and highly destructive stabbing was an attempt to physically penetrate and dominate what he could not sexually penetrate. Following the fatal wounds, he engaged in extreme post-mortem mutilation.
He would frequently eviscerate the victims, completely slicing open the abdomen.
He would meticulously excise the sexual organs, often using his teeth, which is a direct manifestation of that oral sadism rooted in his childhood.
As the bodies are eventually discovered, a very specific, chilling signature emerges, linking these crimes across different jurisdictions. The forensic pathologists note that the victim's eyes have been consistently mutilated.
They are gouged out entirely or slashed violently across the sockets. This isn't just collateral damage from a frenzy. This is a deliberate, targeted action.
During his exhaustive confessions years later, Chikatilo provided the psychological mechanism behind this specific mutilation. It was driven by a deep-seated superstitious paranoia.
He held a genuine belief in the concept of the optogram, an outdated pseudoscientific theory that the human eye acts like a camera lens at the moment of death, permanently capturing and retaining the final image the person saw.
He literally believed the dead eyes held a photograph of his face?
Yes, he was destroying the eyes to destroy the evidence. It perfectly illustrates the dichotomy of his mind.
On one hand, you have the highly calculated, organized predator who uses the state rail system to avoid detection.
And on the other hand, you have a man driven by paranoid, magical thinking, acting on superstitions that border on psychosis.
Now, there is a bizarre anomaly in his modus operandi that we have to explore. When his victims were adult females, the trigger was the failure of sexual intercourse. But when he targeted young boys, the dynamic shifted entirely.
The forensic ritual morphed into a highly structured psychological roleplay. This deviation provides a profound window into his internal need for power.
With male victims, Chikatilo would enact a complex wartime fantasy. He would adopt the persona of a heroic Soviet partisan from World War II.
He would cast the young, terrified boy in the role of a captured fascist or German soldier. He would forcefully bind the boy's hands behind his back with the nylon rope from his briefcase.
Why this specific scenario? I mean, is it just because World War II imagery permeated every aspect of Soviet culture, or is there a deeper mechanism at play?
It is about manufacturing a moral justification for the rage he required to achieve climax. He felt entirely powerless in his real-life emasculated, impotent, a low-level clerk. By casting himself as the heroic partisan, he temporarily reversed that dynamic.
He became the ultimate authority figure, sanctioned by history.
Once the child was bound, Chikatilo would issue a command that was physically impossible for the constrained boy to obey. When the child inevitably failed, Chikatilo used that disobedience as the psychological trigger to execute the enemy.
It was a meticulously structured mechanism to generate the adrenaline and rage necessary to override his impotence.
He was role-playing the power dynamic he was denied in reality. And this psychological machine he built begins to run at a terrifying speed.
The spree escalates dramatically. In 1982, he murders 7 people. In 1983, another 11. And it peaks in 1984, where he slaughters 15 women and children in a single calendar year.
To illustrate how perfectly integrated his camouflage was during this peak period of violence, we have to look at a specific incident at his workplace. It is an anecdote that encapsulates the terror of his proximity to normal society.
His colleagues at the factory noticed that he was obsessively attached to his leather briefcase. He took it everywhere.
He never left it at his desk. He even took it into the communal bathroom with him. To his coworkers, he was just a quirky, overly protective, somewhat pathetic older man.
One day, as a practical joke, a coworker managed to slip a heavy blanket into the briefcase when Chikatilo briefly looked away. They wanted to see his reaction when he picked up the sudden, unexpected weight.
And his reaction is incredibly telling. He doesn't laugh, he doesn't get angry, he pretends it didn't happen. He absorbs the prank and withdraws further into his shell, just shuffling away with his heavy bag.
But what the coworkers didn't know, what makes this harmless office prank absolutely blood-chilling, is what was sitting right next to that brick.
It wasn't just shipping manifests and requisition forms. It was his active murder kit. The knife, the rope, the towel, the Vaseline.
He was walking among his colleagues, sitting in mundane staff meetings, riding the commuter trains shoulder to shoulder with ordinary citizens, fully equipped and psychologically primed to slaughter the moment the right vulnerability presented itself.
Which brings us to a critical juncture in the timeline. The year is 1984. The body count is soaring. Dozens of mutilated corpses have been pulled from the Losopolosa.
The state can no longer completely ignore the physical reality of the bodies, but they are fighting this threat while wearing a massive self-imposed ideological blindfold.
And before we unpack the mechanics of this, we need to be crystal clear with you, the listener.
Right. We're about to discuss the official Marxist-Leninist doctrines regarding crime. We are impartially reporting the historical and political viewpoints of the Soviet state exactly as they are contained in our sources. We are not taking political sides, nor are we endorsing these views. We are simply examining the ideological framework that the investigators were forced to operate within because it directly impacted the body count.
That framework is the foundational obstacle of the entire investigation. The Soviet state doctrine posited that extreme violent crime, and specifically serial murder, was exclusively a vestige of capitalism.
The official ideological narrative maintained that serial killers were a symptom of the exploitation, alienation, moral decay, and class warfare inherent in Western capitalist societies.
So because the Soviet Union was ideologically defined and promoted as a socialist utopia where the root causes of such deviancy had been permanently eradicated, the state fundamentally refused to acknowledge that a domestic serial killer could even exist within their borders.
It was a deeply entrenched institutional denial. Acknowledging a serial killer meant acknowledging a failure of the socialist model. It meant admitting that the utopia could produce a monster.
Because of this, the state-controlled media actively suppressed any reports of the connected murders. The public was kept entirely in the dark.
There were no public warnings, no composite sketches in the newspapers, no alerts to parents to keep their children away from transit hubs. This ideological silence created a massive public safety hazard.
Because the public was denied factual information, human nature filled the void with rumors and paranoia. People in the Rostov region whispered about werewolf attacks or secret plots by foreign Western agents trying to destabilize the region.
But because they didn't know they were supposed to be looking for a mundane, middle-aged man with a briefcase, vulnerable people continued to trust strangers at train stations.
The state prioritized its ideological purity over the physical safety of its citizens. Furthermore, the bureaucratic structure itself hindered the investigation.
There was no centralized forensic database shared between the different Soviet republics.
The MVD in Ukraine was not communicating seamlessly with the MVD in Russia. This meant that Chikatilo could murder a runaway in the Ukrainian SSR, travel a few hundred miles into the Russian SFSR, and murder again, and the system lacked the architecture to connect the two crimes.
Despite all of these systemic advantages, in September 1984, the ghost actually gets caught in the net. Chikatilo is observed behaving highly suspiciously at a central market in Rostov.
He is aggressively approaching young women and girls, trying to initiate conversations. Plainclothes undercover detectives spot him, deem him a public nuisance, and arrest him. They bring him to the precinct and search his briefcase.
And they find the murder kit. They find the knife with the 20-centimeter blade, the nylon rope, and the Vaseline.
This immediately elevates him from a nuisance to a prime suspect. They dig into his background and realize he is a supply clerk who travels extensively along the very railway lines where the bodies are being found.
Even more damning, he perfectly matches the physical description of a man seen walking away with a recent 10-year-old victim, Dmitry Tashnikov.
They have him. He is sitting in an interrogation room. He has the tools, he matches the description, he has the geographical mobility, and they let him go.
They release an apex predator back into the transit hubs, and they do this because of a catastrophic forensic anomaly. We have to dive deep into the science of what happened in that lab because it cost dozens of lives.
This is one of the most tragic and consequential forensic errors in modern history. Prior to his arrest, investigators had painstakingly collected semen samples from the clothing and bodies of several recent victims.
The state laboratories tested these samples and determined that the killer had blood type AB.
So when they have Chikatilo in custody, the very first thing they do is draw his blood. The lab tests his blood, and it reveals that Andrei Chikatilo is type A.
Type A blood, type AB semen. Based on the rudimentary forensic science available to the Soviet investigators in 1984, this mismatch was considered definitive biological proof of his innocence.
They believed it was scientifically impossible for him to be the killer. But the biological science was vastly more complicated than their forensic protocols understood. This hinges on a biological mechanism known as the non-secretor paradox.
We need to explain how the ABO blood group system interacts with bodily fluids. Let's break down the mechanism. How does a person's blood type end up in their semen or saliva in the first place?
In about 80% of the human population, the specific antigens that determine your blood type A, B, or AB are not just confined to your bloodstream. A specific gene, the FUT2 gene, dictates that these antigens are also secreted into your other bodily fluids.
Your saliva, your sweat, your tears, and your semen will all carry the markers of your blood type.
Exactly. These people are known as secretors.
But Chikatilo falls into the remaining 20%.
Correct. Chikatilo belonged to a very rare biological subset known as non-secretors. He lacked the functioning gene required to express his blood-type antigens in his other fluids. His semen did not contain type A markers. It was antigen blank.
So if his semen was blank, how did the Soviet lab get a clear type AB reading from the crime scene samples?
Contamination. The extreme violence of the crimes meant the crime scenes were biologically chaotic. The semen samples collected from the victims were highly degraded and mixed with the victims' own bodily fluids, their blood, their sweat, vaginal or rectal secretions.
And the lab found AB antigens in the mixed sample.
It is highly probable that the AB reading came entirely from the victim's own biology, mixing with Chikatilo's blank semen. But the investigators did not understand the granular complexities of secretor status versus non-secretor status.
They looked at the report, type A blood, type AB semen. They concluded mathematically they had the wrong man.
This is where we see a system completely trapped by its own narrative. If you scientifically prove a man's blood doesn't match the physical evidence, protocol dictates you let him go.
But we have to ask, how much of that release was driven by genuine forensic limitation, and how much was driven by the ideological comfort of dismissing a local, employed, party card-holding family man as a suspect?
It is a fatal synergy of both. The forensic ignorance provided the objective scientific justification for the release, but the ideological bias provided the immense psychological relief.
It was deeply, fundamentally comforting for the authorities to believe that this quiet, unremarkable clerk couldn't possibly be the sadistic monster mutilating children in the woods.
He didn't fit the profile of a capitalist degenerate. So they signed the release papers, he walks out of the precinct, picks up his briefcase, and over the next 6 years, he murders dozens more.
The timeline stretches on, the bodies continue to accumulate, and it isn't until 1990 that the snare finally begins to close. The environment has fundamentally changed.
Mikhail Gorbachev's policy of glasnost, which translates to openness and transparency, has dismantled the state's monopoly on information. The media is suddenly allowed to report on the systemic failures and the horrific details of the murders.
The ideological blindfold was forcibly removed by the press. The public is finally aware of the monster in the Lesopolosa, and they are terrified and outraged.
The political pressure on the MVD is immense. They can no longer hide behind clearance quotas. 2 lead detectives, Major Mikhail Fedosov and investigator Viktor Burakov, are tasked with stopping the slaughter.
They launched a massive coordinated tactical net known as Operation Lesopolosa. Explain the mechanics of this operation, because it wasn't just about putting more boots on the ground. It was a highly calculated strategy of displacement.
Fedosov and Burakov analyzed the geographical data and realized the killer was utilizing the railway network radiating out from Rostov like a spiderweb. They couldn't patrol every inch of the forest, so they decided to manipulate the killer's movements.
They saturated all the major busy railway stations with highly visible uniformed police officers and military patrols. They are acting as a deterrent. They want the killer to see the uniforms.
Exactly. They knew a predator relies on opportunity and camouflage. The heavy uniform presence would deter him from hunting at the major hubs. They deliberately funneled him.
They wanted to push him out to the smaller, isolated rural stations, places like Don Leskaz and Lesostep, where the crowds were thinner.
And at these small stations, they hid teams of highly trained, plainclothes officers watching the tree lines.
The strategy works flawlessly. On November 6, 1990, the trap springs at the tiny Don Leskaz station. A plainclothes officer named Igor Rybakov is embedded at the station, scanning the woodland edge.
He sees a man emerge from the dense trees of the Lesopolosa. It's Andrei Chikatilo. And Rybakov's trained observations in that specific moment are what finally bring the beast down.
He notes a series of glaring, contradictory anomalies. First, the man is wearing a formal suit and tie. He is carrying a flimsy nylon sports bag.
To a trained investigator, this immediately flags him as highly suspicious. The Lesopolosa is dense, tangled brush. The only legitimate civilian reason to be emerging from those deep woods in the freezing chill of November is to forage for wild mushrooms, which is a very common local pastime.
But a man aggressively foraging in the brush does not wear a formal business suit, and he certainly doesn't carry a thin nylon bag that would crush whatever he collected.
Rybakov looks closer and sees physical evidence of a struggle. Chikatilo has dirt and grass stains deeply ground into the knees of his formal trousers. He has a red smear, which looks distinctly like blood wiped across his cheek.
And most importantly, Rybakov notices that one of Chikatilo's fingers is heavily bandaged and actively bleeding.
That bleeding finger is the critical piece of forensic evidence. We later learned through confessions that the wound was a defensive bite mark.
Chikatilo had just engaged in a horrific struggle with his final victim, a 16-year-old boy named Viktor Tishenko.
Tishenko was strong. He fought back fiercely, and he managed to bite through Chikatilo's finger down to the bone before being overpowered and murdered. Rybakov stops Chikatilo, demands his identification papers, notes his name, his address, and his demeanor, and files a detailed suspicious person report.
A few days later, a 22-year-old woman named Svetlana Korostik is found mutilated in those exact woods near Donleskos. The police cross-reference the area, pull Rybakov's report, and the name Andrei Chikatilo surfaces again.
This time, there is no biological mismatch to save him. The police initiate intense round-the-clock surveillance. For 6 days, undercover teams shadow his every move.
They watch him prowl the transit hubs. They observe his hunting methodology in real time.
They watch him approach lone children, women, and teenagers, attempt to engage them in conversation, and if he is rebuffed or ignored, they watch him pivot immediately to the next potential target. He is a machine searching for a vulnerability.
Finally, the authorities decide they have enough behavioral evidence. On November 20, 1990, outside a cafe in Novocherkassk, 4 plainclothes officers move in. They arrest him. He offers zero resistance.
He was placed in a holding cell at the KGB headquarters in Rostov. The lead interrogator assigned to break him is a seasoned veteran named Isa Kostoyev.
But Kostoyev hits a massive, impenetrable brick wall. For over a week, Chikatilo sits in the sterile interrogation room and denies absolutely everything.
He is calm. He claims he is a victim of police harassment. He insists he is just a grandfather and a supply clerk. And the police are facing a massive legal hurdle.
Under Soviet law at the time, they only have 10 days to hold a suspect without formal evidentiary charges.
The clock is ticking down, and the physical evidence they have, while highly suggestive, is still largely circumstantial. They haven't found the bodies hidden near Donleskos yet. They desperately need a confession to secure the charges before the 10-day mandate forces them to release him again.
And this is where the investigation takes a revolutionary turn for Soviet criminology. They bring in the psychiatrist.
Yes. Years prior, when the investigation was stalling and the MVD was out of ideas, investigator Burakov had quietly sought the help of Dr. Alexander Bukhanovsky, a highly prominent local psychiatrist.
Bukhanovsky had achieved something previously unheard of in the Soviet system. He had drafted a comprehensive predictive psychiatric profile of the unknown killer. He titled his profile The Necrosadist.
We have to explore how Bukhanovsky gathered his data, because he was working in a system that denied serial killers existed. He didn't have FBI behavioral science manuals to rely on.
Bukhanovsky built his profile through immense deductive logic and reverse engineering the crime scenes. He looked at the extreme overkill, the specific mutilation of the sexual organs, and the deliberate targeting of the eyes.
He deduced that the violence wasn't random anger, it was a compensatory mechanism for sexual dysfunction. He looked at the geography and deduced the killer had to have a job that allowed for travel without suspicion.
The accuracy of his profile, once compared to the reality of Chikatilo, is staggering. The police had spent years assuming they were looking for a deranged homeless lunatic, or perhaps a mentally disabled outcast living in the woods.
Bukhanovsky completely dismantled that assumption. His profile stated that the killer was a man between the ages of 45 and 50. He predicted the man was highly educated, likely holding a university degree.
He stated the killer was almost certainly married, possibly with children, holding down a steady, unremarkable job, and blending perfectly into the fabric of society.
Crucially, Bukhanovsky pinpointed the exact psychopathology. He stated the killer suffered from profound sexual dysfunction, likely impotence, and was driven by a massive, deep-seated inferiority complex rooted in early childhood trauma.
He argued that the mutilation was not the goal, but the grim mechanism required to achieve the dominance he lacked in every other aspect of his life.
So with the 10-day holding period about to expire, interrogator Kostoyev makes a desperate, unconventional play. He brings Dr. Bukhanovsky directly into the interrogation room to face Chikatilo.
And the dynamic of this confrontation is fascinating. Bukhanovsky doesn't yell. He doesn't slam his fists on the table. He doesn't threaten the firing squad.
He simply sits down across from this man, opens his file, and begins to read his psychological profile out loud.
It is a moment of profound surgical psychological dismantling. You have to put yourself in Chikatilo's mind in that moment. Here is a man who has spent 54 years hiding his true nature.
He has lived behind a meticulously constructed wall of boring normality. He carries a secret, internal universe of unimaginable sadism that he believes makes him superior to everyone else.
And suddenly, a stranger sits across from him and clinically, calmly, and accurately maps out the deepest, darkest architecture of his own mind.
It's the mechanism of being understood. He hears his impotence, his lifelong rage, his childhood trauma, his desperate, pathetic need for control, all articulated perfectly.
And crucially, it is delivered without moral judgment. Buchanovsky is diagnosing him, not condemning him.
That is what broke him. It wasn't the threat of execution or the aggressive tactics of the KGB that cracked his facade. The most powerful weapon the state finally deployed wasn't a gun, but a mirror.
When faced with the clinical reality of his own pathetic pathology, the superiority complex shattered. Chikatilo begins to weep. He looks at Buchanovsky and simply says, "Yes, it's me."
And over the next several days, the floodgates open. He provides exhaustive, encyclopedic confessions to 56 murders. He leads police to undiscovered graves deep in the woods, and he details forensic aspects of the crimes that only the killer could possibly know.
This psychological breakthrough leads to a concept that Buchanovsky later coined the Chikatilo phenomenon. I want to dive into the loop of this phenomenon because it changes how we understand the genesis of this kind of predator.
The Chikatilo phenomenon proposes a terrifying developmental model. It suggests that predators of this extreme magnitude do not necessarily start their lives wanting to become serial killers.
They aren't born with an innate desire to butcher people.
Instead, the killing is the terminal symptom of a psychological addiction. They become addicted to the escalation of sexual degradation as the only viable mechanism to alleviate profound, unbearable feelings of inferiority, emasculation, and trauma.
It is a neurological feedback loop. The violence provides the climax provides temporary relief from the inadequacy, but the relief fades. And like any addiction, tolerance builds.
The next time, the violence has to be more extreme to achieve the same release. The murder isn't the primary goal. The murder is just the necessary byproduct of an escalating addiction to absolute power.
Exactly. It is a compensatory addiction that requires a human sacrifice to function. And once that confession was fully documented, the judicial process finally, slowly began to grind forward. The trial kicks off in April 1992 in the city of Rostov-on-Don.
And the atmosphere surrounding this trial is one of absolute chaos and unprecedented public rage.
Because of Glasnost, this isn't a secret military tribunal. The trial is entirely open to the public. The media is broadcasting the horrific, granular details of the 52 murders he is charged with.
The families of the victims are packed into the courtroom, and their grief and rage are physically palpable. To protect Chikatilo from being literally torn apart by the grieving parents and siblings, the authorities are forced to construct a massive, custom-built iron cage right in the center of the courtroom.
And inside that iron cage, Chikatilo's behavior is incredibly erratic and theatrical. He routinely disrupts the legal proceedings. He pulls down his trousers to expose his genitals to the judge and the families.
He screams that he's a pregnant woman. He shouts obsolete, patriotic political slogans from the Stalin era.
We have to analyze this behavior. Is this the genuine collapse of a fractured mind under the weight of his crimes, or is this a calculated legal strategy?
It was a highly transparent, desperate attempt to feign psychosis. He was trying to convince the court that he was legally insane. If he was deemed insane, he would be sent to a psychiatric institution rather than facing the firing squad.
He was attempting to weaponize madness to save his own life.
But the psychiatric experts at the Serbsky Institute in Moscow, who conducted a massive 60-day evaluation of him, saw right through the theatrics. They had to differentiate between severe psychopathology and legal insanity.
That is the crucial legal distinction. The Serbsky Institute concluded that Chikatilo absolutely suffered from a severe borderline personality disorder with intense overriding sadistic features. His mind was deeply sick.
However, they determined that he was entirely aware of his actions. He knew the difference between right and wrong. The proof of his sanity was in his methodology.
He took calculated, logical steps to avoid detection. He used the transit system, he cleaned his weapons, he disposed of bodies in isolated areas, and he maintained a functioning cover identity.
A legally insane person disconnected from reality does not meticulously clean a murder weapon and go back to work as a supply clerk. He was declared legally sane and fully competent to stand trial.
On October 15, 1992, the judge delivered the verdict. The court found Andrei Chikatilo guilty of 52 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death 52 times.
He spent the next year and a half on death row, launching a series of desperate appeals for clemency to Russian President Boris Yeltsin, claiming he was a victim of a toxic society.
Yeltsin rejected the final appeal, and the sentence was carried out. On February 14, 1994, in a soundproofed execution room in Novocherkassk prison, Chikatilo was executed by a single gunshot to the back of the head.
He was buried in an unmarked, anonymous grave. But the legacy of the Rostov Ripper did not end with that gunshot. The exposure of his crimes, the very public dismantling of his life, permanently shattered the deeply held Soviet myth of a crime-free socialist utopia.
The state was forced to look in the mirror and publicly admit that their rigidly controlled society was entirely capable of incubating and protecting monsters.
But even more disturbingly, the sheer scale of his crimes birthed a dark ripple effect in Russian criminology. He didn't just become a cautionary tale, he became a benchmark for future pathology.
His horrific body count created a macabre competition for future predators. Most notably, a man named Alexander Pichushkin, who became known as the chessboard killer operating in Moscow during the early 2000s.
Pichushkin actively modeled his crimes as a literal competition with Chikatilo's ghost. He explicitly stated to investigators that his goal was to kill 64 people, one for every square on a chessboard, specifically to surpass Chikatilo's official record of 52 convictions.
Chikatilo shifted from being an anomaly to a dark idol for a new generation of killers seeking historical dominance.
We have spent the last hour unspooling a narrative of immense tragedy and unimaginable cruelty. We have mapped the convergence of severe psychosexual pathology in one man who was allowed to operate unimpeded by a blindly ideological, highly bureaucratic state apparatus.
For 12 years, an apex predator operated in the shadows of ordinary society, riding commuter trains, working in a factory, and hiding behind the mundane facade of a grandfather. He was shielded by a system that simply refused to believe he could exist.
If we pull back and connect this forensic case study to the broader human condition, it provides a devastating lesson in the danger of institutional narratives.
The Soviet state ignored the Rostov Ripper because he didn't fit their political narrative of what a criminal should look like. They ignored the data, the missing children, the blood in the snow, the escalating violence because the data contradicted their ideology.
It proved that knowledge, evidence, and science are only valuable if a society is genuinely willing to accept truths that challenge its fundamental self-image.
The diagnostic tools were there, but the authorities refused to look at the film because they were terrified of the diagnosis. They ignored the monster because he didn't fit the story they were telling themselves. And as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to mull over as you step back into the normal world. In our modern, hyper-connected, incredibly data-driven society, we like to think we are immune to such profound systemic blind spots. We think we see everything clearly. But what uncomfortable truths is our society currently refusing to see simply because they don't fit the story we desperately want to tell ourselves?